And here we are back for the last installment of A Child's War Living on Orkney. It's sort of like being on a visit to Orkney, isn't it? I think it's very interesting. Of course, security was a concern and led to perhaps understandable overreaction. Jim Sutherland was tall and blond and dressed in boots and gansey as he headed for his sailing boat. The MPs let him leave headquarters a few hours later after his family went along to Stromness Hotel to vouch for him not being a Norwegian who had just crossed the North Sea in a boat that had been found in sanded rock. Some officers took a rather unusual approach to checking security. One walked all the way along the street dressed as a German. To his fury, he wasn't challenged even once. The general himself took to breaking into camps and leaving a sign of his undetected presence. Next morning, the unfortunate camp would have its shortcomings pointed out. There were many trigger-happy guards around Stromness, longing for a chance to pepper the general's backside. Whoops. When Eric Linklater received his military appointment, his wife Marjorie, who became such an integral part of Orkney society, wasn't at all sure she wanted to spend all the year in Orkney and expressed her concern about facing a winter there. The postmistress reassured her. "Ah, but oh, if ye can stand the summers, the winters are not so bad." She had good reason to say that, as during the war years, at least one summer was so gray and wet that the children were given vitamin D tablets when they went back to school. It was commonly believed in Stromness that it was the fault of Ness Battery, whose guns were breaking up the cloud layers. It was so reliably wet that Mum remembers deciding with her friends which indoor play area they were going to use the next day. All the ships in Scapa Flow had their own drifters to ferry personnel and supplies to and fro. These vessels were not large enough to have their own drifter, were well served by the trot boats. They were operated from an office in Lynness and could be sent anywhere in Scapa Flow on any errand. My uncle Walter, later the long-serving purser on the St. Olaus, began his seagoing career on the trot boats. Traditionally, the newest member of the crew had to be the cook, no matter what their aptitude for the role. This was no problem for Walter, who was a born cook, but then the young son of the Long Hope headmaster joined the crew. His father had been unable to persuade him to stay on in school and asked the crew to help convince the boy that a life at sea wasn't for him. They did their bit by giving him a fairly hard time, especially about his cooking. This wasn't hard to do because it really was dreadful. They finally told him that if he burnt the porridge again, they were going to throw him over the side. Next morning, they were as good as their word, but they did throw the life belt after him. He wisely decided to return to dry land and his studies. He was by means the only bad cook around. At the small camps, some luckless recruit seems to have been chosen entirely at random. My grandmother was asked to give weekly lessons to the cook of a camp near Houghton, in the hope he could master some basic meals before his comrades went down with food poisoning or malnutrition. Over a few weeks, she made some progress, but then the lessons stopped. A visiting senior officer, on seeing the food that was being served, had lined up all the men and asked them what they'd done in civilian life. Reluctantly, one of them admitted to being a cook. He had decided he'd like to do something different during the war service, but he was dispatched post-haste to the kitchen. At the beginning of the war, as the servicemen flooded in, there was a bit of a culture clash. The minister in Sunday recorded the shock of his parishioners at the language used by the men building a wireless station, and the men on anti-aircraft gun were taken aback when their undemonstrative Orcadian fellow gunners applauded instead of cheering when they shot down a plane. It soon settled down to cheerful coexistence, and one small plus to be taken from the war were the war bonds that were formed and the windows that were opened on both sides to both different worlds. Quite a few servicemen remembered their time in Orkney with such fondness that they retired here, and many never left at all, adding another flavor to the rich Orcadian mix. Thank you very much. We did it. That's the 5th section of our A Child's War, Life in Orkney. Thank you so much. We'll come back again. Thank you.